Hey guys! Tonight, beneath the flickering candlelight and the sound of the wind whispering through the cracks of an old castle door, I want to tell you a story quite unlike what we were ever taught to believe about princesses. There will be no silk gowns, no gentle music, no gallant knight arriving to save the day. Only cold stone walls, marriages decided long before they were old enough to speak, and young women who had to learn to smile while the world made choices in their name. A girl would never wish to be a princess. Not if she knew what a princess's life was truly like. For behind every crown are sleepless nights, whispered prayers in solitude, and the quiet footsteps of women imprisoned within a title they never chose. So, before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these stories truly bring you something of comfort. And as always, tell me where you're listening from, what time it is for you, and whether the weather outside feels perhaps a little like that of a winter castle. Now turn off the lights, wrap yourself in something warm, and let us drift together, gently, into tonight's story. Everyone has heard the old fairy tales. A princess in a pointed hat, locked away in a high tower, waiting for a knight on a white horse to come and save her. It sounds gentle, beautiful even, as if all she ever needed to do was sit there and wait for destiny to knock upon her door. But if you were to turn back to the 13th century, those stone walls would tell you another story. A story without music, without love, only silence, cold mist, and rules so suffocating they could crush a soul. In the Middle Ages, the tower was not a symbol of romance. It was a prison built from control. They called it a safe place for women, but the truth was this: it was safe only for the honour of men. Inside, a princess was not a free person. She was a political possession. She was guarded like a precious gem, never to be touched by sunlight or wind, for even the smallest scratch upon her reputation could bring shame to an entire dynasty. Those girls lived in narrow, damp rooms, cold as the stone that built them. The window was no more than a slit of sky, the hearth no more than a flicker that could not warm her heart. By day, they embroidered, prayed, or practiced how to walk gracefully. By night, they lay on wooden beds, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the wall and the faint scurry of rats in the dark. That was the real life of a medieval princess. Beautiful in paintings, but utterly lonely in truth. They were never asked what they wanted. Their marriages were decided when they were still children, sealed by treaties, by a handshake between kings. Their lives changed hands long before they could choose. As they grew older, they knew they were not born to love, but to be given away. What history calls a noble destiny was merely a chain of obedience stretching from birth to death. In the few diaries and letters that remain, many princesses wrote that they lived in golden cages. They ate well, dressed beautifully, had servants, but nothing was ever theirs. No voice, no choice, no dreams. The only thing they were allowed to keep was silence, and in that silence they were taught that obedience was virtue. The thick stone walls became symbols of order. Men believed they were protecting women's purity, but in truth, they were protecting their own power. For a woman who thought, who desired, who spoke, was the most dangerous thing in a world built for men, and so the towers rose higher and colder, built to keep women safe, which really meant silent. Yet even in that silence there were small moments of defiance. A princess who lingered too long at a window, a secret letter written in Latin to a forbidden love, a smile at the wrong time, a word that contradicted her father, tiny gestures, but in that time they were acts of courage. Because a single rumour, true or false, could ruin her, exile her, erase her from history. Still, people always find ways to survive. Many princesses used their minds. They read, wrote, taught their children, or composed political letters to claim a fragment of power in a world that denied them any. Some chose silence and watched, waiting. Others preferred to be called rebellious, improper, even wicked, if that meant living a single day true to themselves. The tower, therefore, was more than a home. It was an entire metaphor for an age. It held within it the isolation of women, the fear of men, and the silence of history. And the irony: men of that era wrote stories of maidens in towers, then cast themselves as saviours. They imagined women being rescued by love, but no one ever came, and if they did, it was only to take her from one tower to another, larger, richer, but still a prison. So when you hear someone say, "A princess lives in luxury," remember this: velvet can be a kind of chain. Every gown is a suit of fabric armour, every feast a performance, every smile an act of survival. No one tells you that many princesses cried when they were told they would be married, not because they were weak, but because they understood better than anyone that their lives would no longer belong to them. So if you ask, were princesses happy? The truest answer might be, no one knows, because happiness does not live inside a role. It lives inside freedom, and that was something they were never given. Fairy tales turned loneliness into beauty, and control into love. But on cold nights, in towers without light, if you listen closely, you might still hear the wind whispering through the cracks, and within it, perhaps, a faint sigh. The sigh of women who once lived, once waited, and once wished for something simple, to be as free as the birds beyond their window. And perhaps in that quiet endurance they saved themselves, not with swords, not with magic, but with intellect, patience, and dignity. It is the kind of strength history rarely writes down, but it exists between the blank spaces of chronicles where no one reads, but where their breath still lingers. Princesses never needed knights. They only needed to be seen, to be understood, and to be remembered, not as daughters of kings, but as human beings who dared to live truthfully in a world that forbade it. The word princess, the one we so easily use today, soft and shimmering with dreams, did not yet exist in the Middle Ages. In the chronicles of the 13th or 14th century, you will not find it written anywhere. They were called instead daughter of the king, or simply lady, a plain, almost cold designation, enough to mark their place in a lineage, but not in a life. And within that simplicity lies an entire world of loneliness, where women were born not to be remembered, but to be used. It might sound like a small matter of language, but in truth, it reflected the entire social order of the age. The absence of a word for princess meant the absence of an independent role for her. A boy was born a prince, a word bound to power, inheritance, and war. A girl, though of the same blood, was only a lady, a polite way of saying she belonged to someone else, lady of this, daughter of that. In the very grammar of her existence, her identity was always attached, never her own. No one was ever princess of herself. The name came late, but the solitude came early. From the moment of her birth, she was surrounded by ceremony and by law. A servant changed her swaddling cloths. A court matron noted the hour of her first breath to divine omens. A priest blessed her, not for herself, but for the fortune of the dynasty. A newborn girl was already a piece in the game of men's power. No one told her she might learn, choose, or live as she pleased. Every lesson revolved around restraint. Speak softly, move slowly, bow your head. As she grew, she learned to sit straight in gowns that weighed more than she did, to smile when others decided her future, to endure pageants where she herself was both ornament and offering. In every ritual, baptism, betrothal, marriage, she existed not as a person, but as part of the scenery. There was no princess, therefore, no story written for her. History recorded kings, generals, bishops. Women appeared only in the margins, wife of, daughter of, sister of. And so when the word princess finally emerged, somewhere around the 15th or 16th century, it carried a sweet deception. A new word, but the same old truth. Society had simply traded the tower for an image, replacing walls of stone with walls of expectation. Be beautiful, be gentle, be grateful for your silks. Had you called them princesses in their own time, they might have laughed, not out of pride, but out of pity for the illusion. That word was for outsiders, for those who looked in and mistook obedience for privilege. To live within that illusion was to know that luxury could be its own chain. The irony is sharp. Language gave them a name only to hide them further. Princess, a word that sounds like music, but in truth belonged to fiction, not to flesh. The women themselves lived not in fairy tales, but in cold chambers where every gesture was watched, every feeling corrected. If they cried, they were weak. If they rebelled, they were mad. If they stayed silent, they were virtuous. Without a word for princess, history never learned how to speak of them. Chroniclers cared only whom they married, how many children they bore, what alliances they secured. In many manuscripts, their names were misspelled or erased altogether. The only woman named again and again was Mary, the Holy Mother, held up as the eternal example that gentleness, endurance, and silence were divine. But silence does not mean emptiness. Between the dry lines of chronicles, a few letters remain, fragments of diaries, where they whispered of longing, of fear, of the small joys of choosing something for themselves, a book to read, a dog to keep, a flower to plant by the window. These tiny acts were the proof of existence. Some say that language creates worlds. If that is true, then the absence of the word princess means that the medieval world never imagined those women as beings who deserved to be named. Perhaps that is why their loneliness arrived so soon, because no one had a word for them, no one a language to hold their worth. When we read history today, we say princess with admiration, even with tenderness. But look closely, and behind that title lies not a crown, but the marks of waiting, of silence, of dreams thus taught to sleep. The title came later. The solitude was there from the start. And in a world where everything was named by men, perhaps the bravest thing those women ever did was simply to exist. The medieval court was a stage where every important role belonged to men. Power was measured in land, swords and bloodlines, never in wisdom or compassion. Kings ruled, generals fought, bishops preached. Every hand that held authority was a man's hand, and women, even princesses, were merely shadows at the edge of the frame, faces painted beautifully to decorate the politics of men. A princess was born amid grandeur and ceremony, but from her very first breath she absorbed a silent lesson. Speak little, lower your gaze, and accept. Ladies in waiting taught her how to sit. Her mother taught her how to smile, and her father taught her silence. In the world of men, a woman's quiet was a virtue. Her voice, a flaw to be corrected. The less she spoke, the more she was admired. From an early age, royal girls understood they were not allowed to exist as individuals. They existed as bridges, gifts to be exchanged between thrones. A well-timed smile could seal a treaty, a frown could start a war. Their beauty was not their own. It was judged, discussed, and used as bargaining power. Every feature, every strand of hair, every graceful motion was national property, a tool to attract, persuade, or sacrifice. The court was a world where everything had a price, a handshake, an oath, a son. Every move was calculation. On this grand chessboard, the princess was a pawn, easily moved, easily replaced. When she was needed, she was married off to pacify a neighbouring kingdom. When she was not, she was forgotten in a distant castle, living beside a stranger, mentioned only in diplomatic papers. Men gathered in council chambers, debating wars and shaping the fate of nations. Women sat in their chambers, mending the clothes of those who would go to fight. And even though a princess shared the same royal blood as the king, she was not allowed to cross the threshold of the room where decisions were made. An invisible wall split the world in two. On one side, power, on the other, the ornaments of that power. And yet, within that seemingly absolute world of men, women learned the art of survival. They mastered observation, listening, timing, a well-placed word, a thoughtful gift, a knowing glance. Sometimes that was all it took to alter the course of events. Beneath the still surface of their silence lay an intricate web of wit and calculation. A princess understood that she could not wield a sword, but she could wield a pen. She could not issue decrees, but she could write letters. She could not sit in council, but she could whisper in the ear of the one who did. In a man's world, that was the only way to preserve a fragment of her own voice. Still, the injustice was clear. When a prince was ambitious, he was driven. When a princess spoke her mind, she was defiant. When a man used marriage to secure power, it was called strategy. When a woman dared to love, it was scandal. Every act of hers was magnified under the lens of morality, a morality that only pointed one way and always punished women first. The world of men did not only exist outside, it crept inside the minds of the women themselves. They were taught that the order of things was natural, that submission was duty, that silence was beauty. And for generations, mothers taught their daughters the same, not out of blindness, but survival. A long lineage of women teaching how to live without being punished. There was a tragedy in this. A princess's beauty was the only thing praised, and the very thing that bound her most tightly. Beauty did not grant her freedom, it turned her into an instrument. She was painted, displayed, and sacrificed for the prosperity of her bloodline. Beauty was not pride, it was a burden carried without complaint. The world of men, therefore, was not confined to the court. It was the entire structure of society, the laws, the faith, the education, even the prayers. God was the father, the priest was a man, the king was His Majesty. And every woman, princess or peasant, was defined by the man to whom she belonged. But history often forgets to tell one thing. Within that world of men, the silent women understood power more deeply than anyone else. They saw it, sensed it, and sometimes turned it back upon itself, using the very fragility men attributed to them as a form of quiet strength. They did not need to shout, they needed only to endure, longer, wiser, and with a knowing smile. The medieval princess, then, was the embodiment of paradox. Born in glory, living in chains, revered for her purity, imprisoned by it. She was the product of a world written by men, and yet she found ways to write a few lines of her own. In history, her name is rarely spoken, but between the pages filled with kings, wars, and cathedrals, her traces remain. A signature at the end of a letter, a line of counsel erased by a scribe, a decision credited to another. The world may have belonged to men, but it was the women who kept it turning silently. Adela of Normandy, daughter of William the Conqueror, was married off at the age of 15. Her husband, Stephen of Blois, was 20 years her senior, a count with land, armies and ambition. On parchment, it was a good marriage, one that secured an alliance between two powerful realms. But in life, it was closer to a contract than a love story. A girl barely grown, who had never known freedom, became the rope that bound two dynasties together. In the Middle Ages, marriage was never a union of hearts. It was an instrument of politics, a game in which women were pawns. And in that game, Adela was a valuable piece. Her father, William, had just conquered England and needed to secure his hold over Normandy and the continent. The marriage was carefully arranged. A splendid wedding, a generous dowry, and words of hollow blessing. Everyone rejoiced, except the young bride. What made Adela remarkable, however, was not her lineage, but the way she lived within the role forced upon her. She understood early that in a man's world, silence did not mean powerlessness. She used her years in Blois to learn, not merely to read and write, but to govern. When her husband went to war, she managed the castle, oversaw estates, directed servants, and even corresponded with lords. She learned when to smile, when to speak, and when to listen, the skills of a woman who wielded influence in a world that denied her any. People called Adela gentle, but within that word lay her strategy. Gentleness made her unthreatening, and unthreatening women were left enough space to act. Within that narrow space she built her own quiet power. She organised the finances of Blois, turned it into a centre of learning and faith. When her husband fled the battlefield in fear, it was Adela who arranged the aftermath, sending reinforcements, writing letters of apology, and salvaging the family's honour. In her silence, she saved his name. Adela was no warrior, yet she understood that true strength did not rest in the sword but in a well-timed word. Her letters, humble in tone but firm in meaning, were read and heeded by the great men of her time. When her husband died, she became guardian to their son, the boy who would one day become King of England. History called her the Count's wife, yet it was she who laid the foundations of a dynasty. In the eyes of chroniclers, women like Adela stood in the background, but without them, those in the foreground would have long since fallen. They kept the homes, the people, and the honour, while men chased glory. No monuments bear their names, but the castles still stand, the letters still survive, and their descendants ruled for centuries. This is what history seldom admits, that the women in the shadows held entire worlds in their hands. They did not need praise, only endurance. And sometimes, endurance is stronger than power. In her later years, Adela chose to retire to a convent, not out of guilt, but because her work was done. It is said that she continued to write letters to kings, to her son, to bishops, still governing, still guiding from afar. Perhaps in the cold stone room of that abbey she smiled at last. No one knows if she ever loved, but all knew she lived a life of consequence. The world remembers William the Conqueror as the conqueror, and Stephen of Blois as the failed count. Few remember Adela, the one who held them together through intellect and resolve. If men used swords to draw maps, Adela used her pen to keep them from tearing. If men wrote history through victory, she wrote it through endurance. Her marriage was a chain, but she turned it into a thread that stitched two dynasties back together. She was taught to bow her head, and she did. Just enough to hide the sharpness in her eyes. She lived in a world of men, but she did not let them write her story entirely. When we think of medieval princesses, we often imagine sad, painted faces, women frozen in stillness. But Adela reminds us that behind every still portrait lies an undercurrent of will. She did not rebel, did not overthrow, she endured. And in her time, endurance itself was a form of rebellion. For in the end, Adela was not merely a king's daughter or a count's wife. She was proof of a truth history prefers to ignore, that women do not need thrones to shape empires. They need only memory and a storyteller willing to speak their names. And tonight, as her name is spoken once more, perhaps Adela of Normandy lives again, quietly in the trembling light of a medieval candle. Joan of England, daughter of King Edward I, was only 11 when she was offered as a diplomatic gift. At an age when most children were still learning to embroider handkerchiefs or play with cloth dolls, she was already being promised from one kingdom to another, a prized token in her father's treasury. To the men seated around negotiation tables, Joan was not a person, but a condition, a clause to secure peace, land, or political favour. From the day she was born, she lived as a chess piece on a board she did not control. Her childhood was defined by journeys she never chose. One year, she was betrothed to the Prince of Castile. The next, that alliance dissolved, and she was sent to France. In every transaction, her name appeared in diplomatic letters like a footnote at the end of a treaty. The king's daughter, as guarantee of goodwill. No one asked where she wanted to go, or whether she even knew the man she was promised to. The tapestries changed with every palace, but the cage remained the same. Joan grew up fluent in the language of politics, not of affection. She was taught that if her father commanded her to marry, it was duty. If her husband commanded her to leave, it was fate. And if peace demanded another marriage, it was destiny. There was no room for I in her story, only for the realm, for the crown, and for God. By her 20s, Joan had lived in more castles than many soldiers had seen battlefields. In each new place she had to begin again, learning customs, languages, etiquette. In England she was the princess, in France the bride, in Navarre the symbol of peace. But nowhere was she simply Joan. That was the cruelty. When the world knows your name, yet no one knows who you are. She died at 27, feverish and exhausted after a long journey. Chroniclers recorded it in a single curt line. Princess Joan of England has died, to the sorrow of the court. Not a word about what she loved, feared, or dreamed of. A lifetime reduced to 40 words, because she never had the chance to write one of her own. Look closely at court paintings of the time, and you will see Joan's face everywhere. Women in heavy gowns, distant eyes, standing just behind the laughing men, each one a variation of the same fate. Each treaty signed, each wax seal pressed was another change of hands. Not through violence, but through signatures. Not by whips, but by laws. The irony was bitter. These women were the instruments of peace, yet they themselves never knew peace. They lived in constant movement, between foreign courts, strange faces, and the quiet fear that when war came, they would be remembered not as symbols of peace, but of failure. Their lives were confined within the conditions and titles assigned by others. Perhaps Joan, in her cold palace at night, once wondered if she would ever be allowed to love. But love, that rarest luxury, was forbidden to those born as tools of diplomacy. A misplaced glance, a wrong word could be treason. So she learned silence, as all women of her rank did. Silence for safety, silence for survival. Until, at last, silence became the way history remembered them. When we read about Joan, we find no heroic deeds, no grand defiance. Yet her quiet endurance, in a world deafened by the voices of men, is its own form of strength. the strength of one who endures her binding without losing her humanity, the strength of one who continues to live, fulfill her duty, and keep the world from collapsing around her. Joan had no throne, no statue, no song. But if you listen closely between the dry lines of medieval chronicles, you can still hear her breathing. A long, steady sigh that travels through centuries, shared by every woman who was traded, rewritten, or forgotten. And then you understand, she was never merely a pawn. She was the soul of the board itself. Without women like her, no treaties would have been signed, no dynasties held together. Joan's power lay not in what she did, but in the fact that she endured, patiently, silently, and with dignity, in a world that saw women only as possessions. The life of Joan of England, then, is not an isolated tragedy. It is a mirror for hundreds, thousands of medieval women who were never allowed to live for themselves yet kept history moving forward. And perhaps that is what makes her story unforgettable. That even as a pawn, she managed to remain human. In the long winter months, the palace was never as lively as one might imagine. There were no feasts echoing with laughter, no lutes or flutes filling the halls, only the soft rhythm of a needle-piercing cloth, the faint rustle of pages turned by trembling hands, and the low sigh of wind slipping through the cracks of the stone walls. That was the soundscape of a royal girl's youth, quiet, steady, and sorrowful. Young girls, daughters of kings, counts, or men of high rank, gathered around the hearth, sewing garments for men they had never met. Some practiced scattered Latin verses, not to become scholars, but to pray in the language of the god, to prepare for the role of the virtuous wife awaiting them. Each winter one of them would learn she was soon to be married off. News never arrived directly. It came as whispers, the murmurs of maids, a pitying glance from a governess, or a letter sealed with foreign wax. They say the princess is going north. Her husband is said to be past 30. And then, as though following an unwritten rite, the chosen girl fell silent. She did not ask, she did not weep, she did not protest. For in the palace, silence was not only virtue, it was armour, the last fragile boundary that preserved one's pride. Silence was not merely the sign of grace, it was a mechanism of survival. Those who spoke too much, who questioned, who flinched, were deemed difficult, ungrateful, ashamed to their fathers. So they learned to smile, to hide tears within their curtsies, to say yes in a voice soft as wind brushing the frozen corridor. In that castle, maturity was not measured in years, but in endurance. Each morning they prayed, lit candles, and listened to the priest's sermons on obedience. They sewed, wove, sang in stone-walled rooms with narrow windows where light trickled in weakly, gilding their pale faces. A few dreamed of love, but even dreams were rationed, for love was a luxury in a world where every emotion was regulated. From the outside, the Winter Palace gleamed as a symbol of power and wealth. Inside, it was a gilded convent, cold, still, and filled with words that could never be spoken. The walls kept out the wind, but also the truth of their hearts. Each girl was a small candle, burning quietly, forbidden to fade. As the days passed, they discovered that silence too had its language. A glance could mean refusal. A sigh could be defiance. They could not scream, but they could preserve their will in the way they walked, in how they refused to bow too low. Slowly, in the dimness, silence transformed into ritual, a ceremony of strength. And so, between the tolling bells and frozen stone, princesses grew up, not because they wished to, but because they had no choice. They became women who could endure, who could smile with composure even as their hearts broke. They learned to hide everything, fear, anger, longing, beneath layers of silk and polished courtesies. That was how the world of men forged silent women, not with whips, but with ritual, not with law, but with habit, until even the girls themselves came to believe that silence was survival. The Winter Palace, then, was not just a royal refuge. It was a forge for souls. Soft hearts hardened there, tempered in the cold fire of duty until they gleamed and fell silent forever. History remembers none of their names, yet it was they who wove the very carpets that kings walked upon, not with words, but with silence, not through triumph, but through quiet endurance. The most refined art known only to those who once lived behind the tower's locked doors. In an age when women were taught to sew and bow their heads, there was one princess who did not. Eleanor of England, daughter of Edward III, the king remembered for his ruthless campaigns in Wales and Scotland, did not grow up among roses and tapestries. Her childhood unfolded to the sound of hooves striking frozen earth, of steel meeting steel, and of battle maps unfurled across her father's oak table. While her sisters learned embroidery and etiquette, Eleanor was taught to ride, to handle a sword, and to read strategy. Not because her father cherished her, but because he needed a child strong enough to stand when the world collapsed. From her earliest years, Eleanor lived among soldiers. She knew the smell of armour after conquest, knew how to bind a wound, and could read a campaign chart as others read scripture. People said she had her father's eyes, cold, sharp and steady amid chaos. Perhaps that was why no one dared to underestimate her, even though she bore the title of princess. When she came of age, she was married to Henry of Bar, another alliance sealed in ink rather than affection. But Eleanor was not the kind of woman who waited by a window. When Henry was captured during a campaign in Flanders, most expected her to retreat into prayer, to kneel in a chapel and whisper petitions for his safe return. Instead, she rose. While men quarrelled over territory, Eleanor held the fortress. While lords debated, she wrote letters, clear, commanding, rational, appealing not to pity, but to logic and duty. One of those letters survives. Its tone is calm, its language measured. She does not plead. She negotiates. She does not weep. She outlines political consequences should her king refuse to act. In a world where women were treated as prefaces to alliances, Eleanor wrote as one who belonged to the heart of the field, and what stunned the men who read it was not her argument, but that a woman dared to write it in her own voice. In those years, Eleanor ruled her husband's lands as a governor would. She oversaw defences, managed harvests, collected taxes, judged disputes. Under her authority, the province did not fall into disorder. It thrived, calm and efficient. History leaves few records of her governance, but sometimes silence itself is proof. Chroniclers only fall silent when there is nothing to criticise. Eleanor had no throne, yet she possessed power. Power born of competence, not of name. In an age where a woman's virtue was measured by obedience, she chose the virtue of courage. No sword, no medal, only intellect and resolve. And then, when her husband was freed, history folded its pages as though nothing had ever happened. She resumed her role as lady, standing beside Henry as if she had never commanded troops, never defended a fortress, never spoken with the authority of a sovereign. But those who had lived under her rule remembered. To them, Eleanor was not a princess. She was the keeper of the gate, the woman who proved that strength need not shout upon the battlefield. Sometimes it lives quietly in the calm heart that does not tremble when the world does. If there is irony in her story, it lies in how history remembers her. Centuries later, the chronicles still call her by borrowed names: Eleanor, wife of Henry of Bar, Eleanor, daughter of Edward of Seth. No one recalls that in the winter of 1301, as snow fell on the ramparts, it was that same Eleanor who stood atop the wall and told her soldiers, "No one passes this gate." In a world of swords and kings, Eleanor was a paradox, trained like a prince, traded like a commodity, and remembered like a ghost. Perhaps history almost forgot her. But if one listens closely, between the dry lines of record, one can still hear the pulse of a heart that refused its chains. She broke no laws, she simply existed, and in the Middle Ages, existence itself could be rebellion. And perhaps, on some quiet night within the cold palace, as candlelight trembled on the armour hanging by the wall, Eleanor smiled. A small smile, unseen, unrecorded. The smile of a woman who knew she did not need anyone to rewrite her name, for she had carved it herself, into stone, into wind, and into the memory of those who once stood beneath the command of a princess who could wield a sword. Eleanor of Castile was one of the most powerful women in 13th century England, and one of the loneliest. She was the wife of Edward the Fawn, the king remembered as the Hammer of the Scots, the tireless conqueror. Yet while Edward marched across battlefields, Eleanor fought a quieter, longer war of her own, one for which there were no songs. She gave birth 16 times. Each one was a gamble between life and death. Medicine in her age offered little beyond prayer and holy water. Every pregnancy drew her away from court, confined her to a cold bed in a candle-filled chamber where birth was a vigil, not a celebration. Many of her children never cried. Others lived only a few years before fading, and each loss was observed as ceremony, not of grief but of duty. At court, a mother's sorrow was not to be shouted. Mourning was to be wrapped in black silk and whispered in Latin prayers. The small coffins were blessed. The king stood solemn, and the next day, politics resumed. In the world of crowns, tears were a luxury. But Eleanor was no fragile woman. She didn't let pain destroy her. She turned it into discipline. People called her stern, even cold. But perhaps only a mother who has buried her 10th child could understand what it means to teach oneself hardness. Her coldness was not a temperament. It was armour. Yet amid the rhythm of childbirth and loss, she sowed something else. Knowledge. Eleanor believed that if the world of men was built on swords and laws, the world of women must be sustained by intellect. She hired tutors to teach her daughters Latin, literature, and the management of estates. In an age when girls were taught obedience, she taught them to read and to write, not to become scholars, but to survive. It was said that in the evening she sat with her daughters in the quiet glow of candles, the only sound the scratching of quills on parchment. Her lessons were not written in any book. How to read the hearts of men, how to keep one's footing in a loveless marriage, how to turn perceived weakness into a kind of power. You cannot change the law, she once told them, but you can learn to understand it better than the man who wrote it. Perhaps it was from her that Eleanor of England, her daughter, the one who would one day command soldiers and hold a fortress, inherited her steel, not from her father's sword, but from her mother's silent intellect. When Eleanor of Castile died, Edward the Thor, the Iron King, ordered 12 great stone crosses to be raised along the road from Lincoln to Westminster. People called it the journey of eternal love. Yet to those who understood, it was also a pilgrimage of remorse. The first and only time the war-hardened king wept for a woman. Their love was not a tale of romance, but of partnership. Two people who understood duty more than affection. And yet, Eleanor's legacy reached far beyond love. It was knowledge. Because of her, royal women no longer lived solely in prayer and embroidery. They could read treaties, write letters, and understand that knowledge was a quieter weapon than the sword. History often remembers her simply as the mother of many children. But she was more than that. She was the mother of a generation of women who could think, endure, and survive in a man's world. Amid the rituals of court, Eleanor of Castile left behind no speeches, no grand declarations, only one enduring lesson: that strength does not always lie in the cry of battle, but in the way a woman takes up her pen, teaches her daughters to understand the world, and survives it in silence. In a world where women were married off like diplomatic gifts till love was a luxury. Yet Joan of Acre, daughter of Edward III, chose that very luxury and turned it into the most dangerous act a princess could commit, the act of deciding her own fate. Joan was first married at 12 to Gilbert de Clare, a powerful, distant earl nearly 20 years her senior. She lived in vast castles filled with gold but empty of warmth. When Gilbert died, Joan was 18, a widow, a status both pitied and desired. She owned property, held her own estates, bore a royal name, and, most importantly, had no male heir. To the court she was a valuable commodity, still fit for exchange. Then, amid the long days of mourning, Joan met Ralph de Mortimer, a young knight of no noble birth, no title, no lineage, only the hands of a soldier and the steady gaze of one who looked her in the eye. He did not kneel before her like the others, nor stammer when calling her "Your Grace." They spoke as equals, and perhaps that was why, for the first time, Joan felt alive. They said she loved him out of youthful recklessness, but look closer. It was not only love, it was defiance. For while her life had always been dictated by her father, her king, her nation, this time she chose for herself. Joan and Ralph married in secret. No courtiers, no grand clergy, no royal procession. Only two people. One vow, one candle. To the court it was a crime. To her it was freedom. When news reached Edward III, his fury was like a storm. The man who had conquered Wales, invaded Scotland, crushed men's rebellions, none of those battles had shaken him as much as this. The king who had made thousands kneel could not make his daughter bow. He seized Ralph's property, imprisoned him, and ordered an inquiry into the marriage. But Joan did not plead. She wrote to her father, not to defend herself, but to say, "I am married, and I do not repent." Perhaps it was that calm that silenced Edward. History records no conversation between them, yet what followed spoke louder than words. Months later, Ralph was freed. Joan retained her lands. No punishment, no public penance. Only silence. The heavy silence of a man realizing that all his power could not command the heart of a woman who had tasted freedom. Joan lived the rest of her life quietly, but never submissively. She bore children, built a small household, one without crowns, but with affection. Chroniclers mentioned her only in passing, dismissing her as a troublesome princess. Yet in truth she was one of the first women of the Plantagenet line to break the law for herself, and in an age when freedom was a privilege reserved for men, Joan stole it back. She sought no throne, no dominion, only love, only choice. Yet that choice became her greatest declaration. It's said that years later, when Edward thus was old, he murmured to a courtier, "She was like her mother, and stronger than I thought." A sentence half regret, half pride. Joan died at 30, but her story endured. A reminder that even in a world of swords and kings, the quietest rebellions are the ones that last the longest. No one remembers the shape of the candle that burned on the night she wed Ralph, but perhaps its light still flickers, softly, invisibly, through the centuries, in the hearts of women who, like Joan, dared to choose love over the crown. Joan of Acre, a name that sounds like a wound stitched shut. She had once been a political bride, the daughter who defied her king by marrying in secret. But in the later years of her short life, when all seemed calm, she forced the court into silence once more, not with the sword, nor with words, nor with blood, but with a single quiet act. A seal, small, delicate, but enough to say, I still have the right to decide. It happened when King Edward IX, her father, confiscated the lands of his own son, Joan's brother. A routine act of royal politics, but to Joan it was an insult. And while everyone else bowed to silence, she did not protest aloud or weep in public. Instead, she sent her personal seal to her brother, the only true emblem of individual authority a woman could possess in the Middle Ages. In that world, a seal was not merely a bit of wax and metal. It was will made visible. It was the proof of identity, the presence of a name upon parchment, the right to exist within the record of history. When Joan sent her seal to her brother, she declared, I stand with you. I do not bow. No one knows whether she considered the risk. But what mattered most was this. No one dared to punish her. Perhaps because her father, the iron-willed Edward Uskend, knew that any punishment would only turn her gesture into a symbol, or perhaps because he understood that she acted not out of spite, but out of justice. Joan, who had once been a pawn in her father's hand, was now the only one who dared to reset the board. And that in the 13th century was extraordinary. You must understand. In that time, women had no right to resist. Not in speech, not in law, not in battle. Their defiance could exist only in the most unexpected forms. A letter, a look, a symbol. This was the quiet politics of women, the kind historians rarely record, and yet it was the most enduring form of rebellion. That seal, when sent, was likely carried by a servant through cold corridors, past echoing bells from the chapel tower. But its meaning travelled further than any decree. In a court where every decision was sealed by a man's hand, one woman's seal moved against the current, a small flame flickering within the vast machinery of power. She needed no proclamation, no speech, no audience, only an act, and that act became a declaration of fearlessness. The chronicles record no reaction from the court, no council convened, no reprimand issued, no punishment pronounced. Yet perhaps that very silence is proof of its power. One woman, by refusing to fear, had made power itself retreat a step. Joan's courage did not lie in defying her father, but in refusing to let fear define her. In an age where women were taught to fear God, king, father, rumour, she chose to believe not in safety, but in what was right. And in doing so, she crossed an invisible threshold no woman before her had dared to touch. Perhaps that was why Edward the Fens, though once furious, could never truly hate her. In her he saw the reflection of his own strength, tempered, refined, and, in its way, beautiful. If history is a vast tapestry, then women like Joan are the threads woven against its grain. Small, faint, yet giving the whole its depth. Without them, every kingdom would be only an echo of men's power. Today, when we look back at medieval women, it is easy to imagine them as meek, obedient, invisible. But look closer. It was they who first mastered the art of resistance through wisdom. Not through shouting, but through a gaze. Not through war, but through a seal. And from that, we learn something profound. True strength does not always lie in the power to win, but in the will to stand, knowing one may be crushed and choosing not to yield. Joan did not dethrone her father. She did not rewrite history, but she rewrote how women existed within it. She proved that even in the courts of men there was space for courage, the kind that asks for no witness. And perhaps, if one listens in the long night as wind moves through the stone corridors of old halls, one might still hear the echo of that seal, not the sound of power, but of a woman claiming her right to her own fate. A small act, seemingly trivial. Yet it is such small acts, repeated across centuries, that have kept humanity from falling entirely into silence. The story of Eleanor was not an exception to Joan of Acres. Within the long corridors of palaces, where every wall had ears and every smile carried political weight, there were other women who dared to love, even knowing that in the Middle Ages love was something one paid dearly for. And among them was Eleanor, Joan's cousin, a woman who lived caught between two vows, one made to God and one made to her own heart. Eleanor had once been a devout girl, raised among Latin prayers and the cold stone walls of a convent. In her youth, she took a vow of chastity, pledging her life to God, a choice seen as noble in a world that believed a woman's soul could only be saved by severing it from desire. But perhaps those years of confinement within holy walls taught her more than anyone how impossible it was to lock the human heart. When she came of age, Eleanor was sent from the convent to oversee her family's estates, and there she met a man. Not a knight, not a noble, but a former servant of the royal household, learned, intelligent, with eyes unafraid to meet those of a princess. Their story began without drama, a few exchanges over accounts, a few shared journeys with the retinue. Yet in a society where every gesture was watched, even a glance held too long could be the beginning of sin. Eleanor loved him, not with the innocence of a dreamer, but with the desperation of someone who had lived half her life in silence. But her vow remained, an invisible chain around her wrists, and so, to love, she had to sin. They married in secret, a wedding without the church's blessing, at least not according to its priests. When the news spread, both court and church were outraged. A princess who had once sworn her body and soul to God now dared to break that vow. To them it was not merely heresy, it was the collapse of order itself. Eleanor was forced to write to the Pope pleading for forgiveness. The letter survives still, gentle, calm, yet heavy with sorrow. She did not deny her actions. She only admitted that she had loved, and that this love, though condemned, was the only thing that made her feel alive. The Pope forgave her, but forgiveness, in that world, was never free. Eleanor lived the rest of her days under quiet surveillance, removed from politics and from history. She was no longer named in chronicles, no longer seen at ceremonies, no longer allowed to stand beside her husband in public. Yet in the scattered notes left by her servants, traces of contentment remain, that she often walked in the gardens with him at dusk, that they read together, that she laughed more often than before. Eleanor's love did not change the world, but it made it tremble just a little. For in a society built of stone, she dared to confess that her heart was something that could not be sanctified. And perhaps that is the great paradox of the Middle Ages, that love and sin were two sides of the same coin. The same act could be praised as a saint's devotion, or punished as mortal corruption, depending only on who was judging. Between the commandments of the Church and the decrees of kings, Eleanor, like Joan, found a narrow space for her own humanity, a small place with no throne, no hymn, only two people brave enough to love, knowing the world would condemn them. They say that in the Middle Ages love was a mixture of miracle and punishment. For Eleanor it was entirely true. She lost her honour, her status, but gained the rarest thing of all, the right to feel happiness, a gift denied to many far more powerful than she. Perhaps, in the final nights of her life, when the sound of church bells drifted faintly from afar, Eleanor smiled, not out of regret, but from the quiet understanding that love, though forbidden, brings the soul closer to God than any prayer ever could. And that is the tragedy and the beauty of medieval love. A sin grave enough to be condemned, yet sacred enough to be remembered forever. Mary of Woodstock. The name itself sounds like that of a humble nun, a woman who spent her life in devotion beneath the arches of a church. But she was no ordinary nun. Mary was the daughter of King Edward Yearn, the conqueror of Scotland, builder of stone fortresses. And instead of becoming a queen, she was sent to a convent as a child, part of a royal strategy to remove excess daughters from the game of politics by offering them to God. The convent, in theory, was a place of purity, but purity trembles when a princess walks in. Mary grew up within cold stone walls, yet she never forgot who she was. She still received fine wine, silks, and private musicians. While other nuns embroidered altar cloths, she commissioned artisans to stitch her name into cushions. Others ate black bread. She ordered French wine and preserves. Her convent became a gilded cage, a miniature court draped in piety. She loved dice, a game the abbess called the temptation of the devil. Mary didn't care. On long, freezing nights, when the echoes of vespers faded, she would spread a cloth, place the coins, and play with her attendants in whispers. Once, she lost heavily. Not her soul, just her money. And so she wrote to her father, King Edward, asking him to send more. The tone of the letter, according to records, was both earnest and sly. She said she needed funds to cover the necessary expenses of religious life. It sounds like a jest, yet there was truth in it. Mary didn't beg for gold out of greed, but out of weariness. In a world where every hour was scheduled, prayer, meal, rest, the roll of dice was the only act that made her feel alive. The rattle of ivory on wood, the muffled laughter of her maids, the flicker of candlelight, those were her fleeting moments of freedom. The convent judged her quietly, but no one dared reprimand a princess, and so her small rebellion continued. She prayed at dawn, read her psalms, obeyed the hours, yet her eyes always held a spark the convent could not extinguish. That is the strange thing about royal women forced into convents. They were taught to renounce the world, yet being born so close to power, they never truly left it. The convent was only a palace with thicker walls, stricter rituals, and subtler sins. Mary lived between two worlds, one divine, one human, and she learned to breathe in both. Some called her a hypocrite, a nun who gambled. But look closer and you'll see. She was like every other woman of her age, only more honest about her longing to live. In a society where men could sin, confess, and sin again, a woman who dared to laugh over a dice game was condemned as blasphemous. Yet that very blasphemy was her truest form of life. She did not rebel with swords or scandal, but with small human acts, a glass of wine, a game of chance, a quiet smile, and somehow those little acts became her way of resisting control. Mary grew old within the convent. No children, no crown, but also no regrets. She was no saint, and she never needed to be. She was a woman trapped between heaven and earth, who found a way to exist in both without losing herself. History records only one line about her: Mary of Woodstock, the nun who played dice. It sounds absurd, yet it is a legacy far more vivid than many who wore crowns. For in an age that taught women every joy was sin, Mary chose sin just to feel alive. And perhaps, on some winter night, as the bells called the sisters to prayer, she sat once more at her small wooden table, took the dice into her hands, and let them fall. The faint clatter against stone, the sound of freedom, of defiance, of life itself. In an age when most nobles could not read their own names, Mary of Woodstock, a nun once dismissed as wayward, became one of the few who could read, write and think in her own words. Mary did not confine herself to psalms. She read literature, history, even philosophy. She studied Anglo-Norman, that fluid, intricate fusion of French and English, so she could commission scholars to compile the chronicles of her own dynasty, the Plantagenets. Some said it was a meaningless pastime for a woman in seclusion. But in truth, it was the quietest rebellion a woman of the 13th century could wage. For Mary, knowledge was not decoration, it was escape. Outside the convent walls lay a world of war, politics and arranged marriages. Within, endless hours of prayer blurred into monotony. Only the books, heavy, musky with parchment and beeswax, opened for her another world. One where people dared to ask questions, record thoughts, imagine differently. In her cold chamber, with wind slipping through the narrow window, Mary read of those who had lived and died for power. Kings, queens, knights and saints. Perhaps she read not merely to understand, but to compare. Between herself and them, between the crowned and the forgotten, was the difference truly so vast? Maybe she came to see that knowledge itself was a kind of power, invisible but enduring. A man could wield a sword. She had only a pen. Yet when ink touched parchment, it left a wound, not on flesh, but on the memory of an age. Mary began to write. Small, steady lines, reflections, observations, quiet fragments of wit. She wrote in Anglo-Norman, sometimes lacing in a phrase of Latin. Her tone was never lofty like a monarch's, nor severe like a saint's. It was simple, ironic, profoundly human. In one surviving fragment she wrote, "There are prayers spoken with the lips, and there are prayers written only in the mind. That single line holds her entire life, a woman who learned to pray not through faith, but through understanding." As her manuscripts circulated within the convent, other nuns began to read them. They no longer confined themselves to hymns. They read poetry, astronomy, essays on the soul and the body. The convent that had once echoed only with chants now murmured with voices, debates, questions, the rustle of turning pages. It may have been the quietest revolution in English history. Mary did not preach, did not teach, did not persuade, but through her curiosity she rekindled something the outside world had forgotten, that women too possessed intellect, and the intellect required no permission to exist. The irony was exquisite. The very daughter sent to the convent to preserve decorum became the one who unravelled it. While courtiers still relied on scribes to read their charters, a nun like Mary understood the words more deeply than any of them, and perhaps sometimes reading the official histories she smiled, knowing they were not quite true, for she had seen how power edits memory. Yet within her own notes she wrote a different chronicle, the history of women, a history without wars or crowns, built instead from thought, emotion, and the quiet longing for freedom. No statue bears her likeness, no scholar cites her name, yet her existence is proof that in that cold, stone-bound world there were still small fires that never went out, the fires of the mind. They say that at night the convent lay in darkness, save for a faint glow from Mary's cell, where she sat copying by candlelight, her eyes alive in the gloom. Not because she sought fame, but because she refused to let darkness claim her thoughts. And perhaps that is Mary of Woodstock's true legacy. She led no revolutions, altered no dynasties, but she kept the flame of knowledge alive in a world half asleep. Elizabeth of Rhuddlan was only 18 when the ship carrying her left the harbour of Holland. No wedding drums now, no silks, no golden rings. She was a widow, dressed in mourning black, carrying only one thing with her, the duty to return. The North Sea opened before her, cold, grey, veined with white foam. Waves struck the hull in slow, heavy rhythm, like the breathing of fate itself. The journey took 2 months. 2 months of mud, wind, and salt. The road from Holland back to England was more than distance. It was a ritual of dissolution. Each night she slept in damp inns, surrounded by the sour scent of wine and the smoke of wet hearths. Some nights the rain battered the roof, dripping through in icy threads. Some nights horses died along the road from frost. Servants coughed themselves weak, yet Elizabeth sat steady, her cloak pulled tight, her gaze fixed on the window, on the black sea rolling like the breath of some slumbering beast. She understood that no place was truly home. In Bruges, they had called her the Duchess of Holland. In London, she was the King's daughter. At every port, every stop, she was a token on the political map. Not a woman in a carriage clutching the embroidered kerchief her mother once gave her. She did not cry. No one of her bloodline was permitted tears. But sometimes, as the ship drifted through the grey, she whispered short prayers just to keep her mind from dissolving into the wind. Where the king is, there is home, they had told her once. But now the phrase sounded like a cruel jest. For wherever there was a king, there was politics. And nowhere at all, was there room for a heart. When the ship reached England, Elizabeth stood still for a long while. The land emerged, grey, cold, shrouded in mist. A troop of guards waited on shore, horses stamping, armour glinting. No one said, "Welcome home." No one said, "You have suffered." They bowed silently and escorted her away, as if performing a ceremony older than memory. She walked slowly over the wet ground, holding up her cloak, eyes tracing droplets caught on blades of grass. Perhaps in that moment she understood what those born in palaces never spoke aloud. That freedom was not belonging somewhere, but belonging nowhere. Every road she crossed, every shore she left faint footprints in memory, not of a princess, but of a wanderer eternal. She did not stop to build, she did not bind herself to lose. She simply moved from one kingdom to another, as though her life's purpose was to bridge distant lands with her own fragile body. They say women of that time were weak, but Elizabeth was not weak. She was weary, in the deeper sense of the word, weary of living a life arranged by others. In silence, she learned endurance. In solitude, she learned to see. And in that endless journey with no destination, she found a strange peace. The peace of one who has ceased to demand anything for herself. History belongs to conquerors, but between its cold lines still lingers her shadow. A young woman in black crossing the North Sea, carrying within her a sorrow without name. Not all battles are fought with swords. Some are fought by a woman who keeps walking and never falls. And Elizabeth of Rhuddlan, in silence, in wind, in mud and wave, lived just so. Before the 14th century, the king and his entire court were a moving state. The medieval court was not a place but a current, a vast living body of power in perpetual motion. From castle to abbey, from frozen plains to damp forests, the royal entourage flowed like a river of flesh and will. Pack horses, wagons, guards, priests, servants, singers, physicians, children. hundreds of lives moving together, pulling an entire kingdom across the land on wooden wheels. Amid that ceaseless procession rode the princesses, women born to carry their family's name and to drift within that human tide as ornaments of sovereignty. They sat inside jolting carriages, wooden-framed, springless, leaping with every rut in the road. The roads were rough, the wind merciless, the rain constant, the mud clinging thick to the wheels. And they, the so-called noble, sat upright, eyes open, learning to hold their poise in a world that never stood still. Court life was movement. There was no fixed capital, no home as we understand it. A single reign might see hundreds of relocations in 1 year, to inspect territories, to display royal presence, or simply because the larders of the last castle had emptied. Each departure was an administrative migration. Cooks, scribes, confessors, even the hounds followed. And within that slow migration, the princess became an eternal traveller, rootless, restless, unanchored. In winter they rode through frost, in summer through the stench of sweat and horse. Luxury existed only on parchment. In truth, the road was an ordeal. The carriages jolted until teeth clattered, clothes stiffened with dust and rain, hands numbed beneath leather gloves. Yet no one complained. Duty, in that world, outweighed all suffering. The princesses learned to read the world through the slit of the carriage curtain. Every village passing by was a glimpse of another life. Peasants kindling fires, children running beside the wagons, small chapels rising like commas in an endless text. To them, the world was a stream of images that could never be touched, never possessed. And though they spoke little, they were the invisible centre of all movement. Within those carriages letters were written, seals pressed, news dispatched. Their roles were more delicate than any knight's, binding provinces through marriage, through promise, through mere presence. A nod, a well-timed smile, enough to seal an alliance or delay a war. They were politics in the shape of obedience. At night, the procession halted at a monastery or a borrowed hall. Guards raised tents. Priests prepared the mass, and the princesses, their bodies sore, their faces pale, descended with grace, their gowns smoothed, their voices calm to greet the local lord. They dined beneath torchlight, spoke just enough, smiled on cue. And when the feast was over, they returned to cold beds, listening to the wind threading through the shutters, knowing that by dawn it would all begin again. Chroniclers of the time recorded every journey of the royal court, from York to Lincoln, from Canterbury to Winchester, but none mentioned the women who sat in the carriages along the way. They are absent from triumph and treaty, yet they witnessed the pulse of that entire age. The banquets, the bargains, the deaths, the falling of snow. Perhaps that is why their history is a history of motion, uncelebrated, unbroken, enduring. In a world where men chose every direction, they survived within the unending movement itself, learning to balance within the jolting cart, to preserve dignity in the mire. If the court was a body, they were its bloodstream, silent but essential. No one remembers the woman who rode through that blizzard in a wooden coach, but without her, kingship itself would not have looked as it did, mobile, precarious, and kept alive by the endurance of those born never to stop. Perhaps among the daughters of Edward I, none understood the loneliness of power, or how to transform it better than Margaret. Married for politics, publicly betrayed by her husband, she chose neither lament nor return to England. Instead, she quietly built her own world. The palace of Tervuren in Brabant, distant still, and so beautiful that one might forget it was raised from heartbreak. People called Edward the King of Castles, for he had littered Wales with fortresses to declare English might. Caernarfon, Conwy, Beaumaris, heavy, arrogant things built of blood and stone. Margaret had watched them rise as a child, stone blocks carved and hauled, towers piercing the fog, masons singing through the cold mud. Yet in her memory, those fortresses were not symbols of triumph, but of solitude. For every castle her father built to conquer, he also built a wall around himself. When her husband betrayed her, Margaret did not shatter mirrors or burn letters like the ladies of troubadour songs. She chose a stranger kind of silence. She built. They said that in every stone of Tervuren there was a whisper, the voice of a woman betrayed but unbroken. The palace was smaller than her father's castles, gentler than any fortress of war. Windows opening to gardens, light spilling across the floors, water circling through, trees woven between walls. It was not a fortification, but a realm of her own, orderly, tranquil, human, a place where she could finally exist as herself. Margaret had learned from Edward to see the world through architecture, but she reversed his philosophy entirely. Where he built to rule, she built to endure. Where he used stone to control, she used it to release. In an age when women held no power, she sought the only power that could not be taken, the power to create beauty. And beauty in history is so often dismissed. No one recorded Tervuren's plans as they did the king's fortresses, yet in the surviving notes it is clear. She oversaw construction herself, selected materials, directed artisans, even designed the gardens, an act nearly unheard of for a woman in the 13th century. In a world where men built to mark their names, Margaret built to reclaim hers. There in Tervuren, she spent her later years no longer as Edward's daughter or the Countess of Brabant, but simply as Margaret, a woman who raised a palace as a silent declaration. I too can build a world. Not a sentence spoken aloud, but one etched into every stone, every flower bed, every step laid by hand. They said that in the late afternoons sunlight streamed through Tervuren's windows, striking the grey walls until they glowed with a strange, gentle warmth. Not the glare of crowns, but the pulse of breath. There, Margaret would sit writing letters, reading, or merely gazing upon the garden she'd planted. Wild roses blooming along the wall, the scent of damp earth mingling with grass. No footsteps of soldiers, no vows, no ceremonial noise, only architecture and freedom. If you look upon a map of 13th century Europe, you'll see hundreds of castles named for men, but few places that bear a woman's mark. Tervuren was one of those rare exceptions. It stands as proof of what history so often forgets, that medieval women did not only endure but created, did not only bear life, but shaped the spaces that sheltered it. The palace itself no longer stands whole, but its spirit endures, in later English gardens, in the way stone was taught to soften light, in the very idea that architecture could heal sorrow. Margaret was never famed like her father or brothers. No chronicles praised her deeds, no statues were carved, and yet that absence makes her story linger even more. For in a world where men built to be remembered, she built to be at peace, to reclaim the stillness stolen by kingship and marriage alike. Perhaps, when night falls over Tervuren and the wind drifts through its hollow halls, one can still hear her, not as a cry, but as a breath woven into the stone, the sound of a woman rebuilding herself from her own ruins. And so, in an age of violence, conquest, and heavy walls, the palace of a betrayed woman became the subtlest monument to strength. No noise, no blood, no need for a crown. only stone, garden and steadfastness. Things history once called fragile, but which endure far longer than any throne. If you were to ask, what was the power of a medieval princess? The answer would not lie in thrones or swords, but in things so small they almost seem absurd. A wax seal, a letter, a marriage, a building, or a single, well-timed word. In that world, women were not born to rule. They were born to connect. Yet in those fragile spaces between obedience and silence, they learned the art of soft power, something their kings often lacked. Princesses, the breathing alliances of dynasties, knew they could never wield the sword, but they could wield the pen, and a letter could travel farther than an army. In an age where ink and wax were instruments of politics, they wrote with the precision of diplomats and the tact of mothers. Every greeting, every title carried weight. My dearest brother, my humble request, your loyal sister. Beneath those courtesies flowed rivers of negotiation, persuasion, even threat. Eleanor of England once wrote a letter during a siege, and it saved her life. Margaret of Brabant never held a sceptre, yet built her own palace as a statement of independence. Mary of Woodstock was cloistered in a convent, yet used her correspondence to bargain with the king himself. They did not need thrones, for they had mastered the subtler craft of ruling through presence, not position. Within cold castles their power lay in maintaining order, not the order of kingdoms, but of daily survival. Who entered the chamber, who sat near the fire, who held the keys to the treasury, who decided where the children would be raised. In their quiet domains, they were the invisible prime ministers of noble life, governing in silence. But the deepest lessons of power came not from books or ceremony. They came from loss. When their children died, when husbands betrayed them, when they were sent abroad as bargaining pieces, they discovered that survival itself was power. No one taught them this. They learned it through the endurance of their own bodies and hearts. And so they became masters of emotional power, that delicate weapon more enduring than war. A tear at the right moment could sway a king. A smile at the right banquet could avert a feud. Later ages called them fragile, but fragility in their hands became strategy, an art refined through generations of women forced to live in men's shadows. When they could not rule, they taught. When they could not command, they told stories. When they could not change laws, they raised the children who would. Women like Eleanor of Castile understood that a dynasty was built not only from stone and conquest, but from children who could read, think, and honour their name. That was a power which lasted centuries, quiet, invisible, but indestructible. Sometimes they ruled simply by outliving the men around them. When kings and knights fell on battlefields, they remained, keeping estates intact, arranging burials, preserving the family's name. No chronicler praised them, but without those connectors, kingdoms would have crumbled. The princesses of the Middle Ages learned that true power was not being the loudest voice in the hall, but being the last one still heard. They spoke little, yet their words lingered. They lived within boundaries, yet turned those boundaries into stages of intellect and subtle command. And perhaps that is their greatest lesson for us now, that power does not only exist in control, but in the act of remaining oneself within constraint. Amid marriage, ritual and faith, they found a slit of light, and through it, they shaped the world around them. If Edward a Thun built his realm in stone, his daughters built theirs in resilience and grace. If men ruled through fear, they ruled through faith. If kings waged war with blood, they proved that a wise word could change the fate of a dynasty. History did not call them queens of power, but in truth they held the thinnest, strongest threads of the realm, keeping them from unravelling. That was their legacy. Softness without submission, silence without surrender. And perhaps, if you listen closely at night, through the cold corridors of ancient castles you might still hear them, not shouting commands but whispering the lessons of those who learn to rule without ever being allowed to. They lived in silk and velvet, yet every garment they wore was not a symbol of luxury, but a shackle woven from fabric. In the medieval court, a gown was never just clothing. It was a silent reminder that a woman was born to be seen, not heard. Princesses, ladies, noble women, all were wrapped in layers of heavy gowns made from wool, silk or brocade, embroidered with gold thread or sewn with pearls. But behind that beauty lay the cost of confinement. Their garments were not chosen by desire but by decree. Colour, fabric and shape dictated by rank. The English sumptuary law of 1363 even forbade anyone from wearing cloth or fur above their station. The higher the birth, the less freedom of choice. Each morning required servants to dress them, layer by layer, linen shift, wool gown, embroidered overcoat, veil, girdle, soft shoes, gloves. Nearly an hour of work to become an ornament. When finished, they resembled statues, just splendid, but stiff. The skirts dragged against the floor, the sleeves hung heavy. Every step had to be small, measured, graceful. Even the way they sat or turned their head was trained to convey virtue. A wrong gesture meant a flaw in upbringing. Behind it all lingered an unspoken law. A woman is judged by her appearance. Beauty was not joy, it was duty. A princess was expected to be gentle, mild, obedient, because her composure reflected the dignity of her house. She was taught to smile softly, to speak quietly, to lower her eyes before men, all to preserve an image of perfection. Every stitch on her gown was not mere ornament, but a reminder of her role. Do not stand out more than permitted. Do not move freer than allowed. Fabric, no matter how soft, could bind. And yet some learned to turn the constraint into language. If they could not escape the gown, they could use it. Certain princesses chose their colours and styles carefully, sending political messages through fashion. Deep blue for loyalty, gold for authority, black for mourning, or silent threat. Ceremonies became stages where fabric spoke louder than words. To the outside world they seemed to flaunt vanity. In truth, most were merely performing the parts assigned to them. The dutiful daughter, the faithful wife, the gracious mother. They understood that only by playing their role perfectly could they survive the court. So they smiled, bowed, recited the expected phrases, and hid everything else behind their eyes. Sometimes one of them rebelled. A princess might wear a skirt cut shorter for ease of walking, or a forbidden hue to assert herself. But such defiance rarely lasted. In a world where every glance was surveillance, deviation meant scandal, and scandal could destroy a woman faster than any war. When night fell, they were finally unwrapped from those heavy layers. The fabric slid to the floor, light as breath. Perhaps only then did they truly inhale. But by morning, the gown returned. The ritual began again. A new day, the same existence. People said princesses were born to privilege. That was true. But privilege was not freedom. Their beauty was regulated beauty. Their elegance was supervised elegance. And every piece of fine silk on their skin whispered that they lived not for themselves, but for the honour of others. In portraits they appear serene. High collars, folded hands, still faces. From afar one might think them at peace, but look closer and you can see the fatigue in their eyes, the quiet ache of a life spent within boundaries, not by choice, but by command. Thus, even draped in velvet, they bore the invisible weight of submission, what we call noble grace, was, in truth, a discipline, a way to keep women upright, smiling and silent. And yet, within that silence, something remained unbound. Their thoughts, their memory, their gaze upon the world through the narrow slit of a veil. It was that, small, hidden, enduring, that kept them human and not mere ornaments of power. In the thick tomes of medieval history, their names appear only as brief annotations: wife of, daughter of, sister of, footnotes in the chronicles of men. It's easy to glide past those lines, to see them as shadows beside the throne. But if you pause, if you look into the spaces between the ink, you can still sense their breath there, quiet, persistent, more alive than any king's decree. History for centuries was written in a masculine voice. The scribes were monks, court secretaries, recorders of battles, taxes and lineage. They wrote down what they deemed important: wars, treaties, titles, estates. Everything that didn't fit into the structure of power: letters, kitchens, whispered advice, sleepless nights beside a sick child, was erased. And yet true history lives not only in what was written, but in what was left unsaid. In the letters preserved in monastery archives, the wills addressed to daughters, petitions for land, or small carvings on chapel walls, there lies their real presence. These were the women exiled from the page, yet sustaining the world that the page described. A princess once wrote to a bishop begging him to intervene in her sister's marriage. A nun copied hymns in careful Latin, slipping her name into the corner of the manuscript. A noble woman hired builders to enlarge her garden so she could teach her daughters to read. An act that, in that time, bordered on defiance. Their stories had no dramatic endings, no battles, no triumphs, only quiet endurance. But that endurance was the foundation upon which everything else rested. While kings commanded, these women maintained the kingdom's pulse, arranging marriages, settling feuds, planning feasts, or simply ensuring that the Great Hall's fire never went out in winter. When we speak of the Middle Ages, we recall blood and crowns, but most lives unfolded between such moments, in the silence that followed. And women were the guardians of that silence. They did not write history, but they made it possible for history to exist. Sometimes they wrote words no one would read, a diary in rough Latin, a hand-copied psalm, a letter to a husband at war. In their trembling handwriting, you can feel both loneliness and resolve. They knew those words might never arrive, yet they wrote, because writing was a form of existence. Proof that, even unrecorded, they still thought, still felt, still were. If men's history was carved in stone, theirs was written in air, an echo between lines, a breath between centuries. You cannot see it, but if you listen, you might hear the rustle of parchment, the pull of a needle through fabric, the closing of a wooden door at dusk, the rhythm of lives forgotten by chronicles but essential to the world's continuity. Even erased, their traces remain. The castles they commissioned crumble, but the chapels still bear their faces, unnamed, but there. The language we speak still carries them. Dowry, manor, ladyship, words born from their existence, their duties, their resilience. No one is ever truly powerless who understands their limits. Medieval women were forbidden to rule, yet they learned to guide from within, through letters, marriages, and faith. They mastered the invisible, persuasion, patience, the reading of hearts. With those, they survived, and sometimes quietly triumphed. Time has worn away their ink, torn their pages, erased their names. Yet their choices, small, deliberate, human, still ripple through history. Without them, dynasties would have collapsed, bloodlines would have ended, and stories would have stopped mid-sentence. The fairest tribute we can offer them now is not to fill the gaps, but to recognise them, to see the blank spaces in history as unwritten chapters, not missing, merely unseen, not silent, merely unheard. So when you next read the old chronicles, don't look only at the bold names and the battles. Look at the spaces between, because there, in the stillness between words, the women of the Middle Ages are still breathing, quietly, endlessly, and refusing to disappear. Imagine the final night in a medieval palace. No music, no feast, only the soft flicker of candlelight trembling across a silver mirror. The chamber is vast, the walls cold, the wind sighing through stone, and in the stillness between those breaths, a woman sits alone. No courtiers, no ceremony, no one left to please. Only her own breathing, a breath she has spent her whole life suppressing, because she was taught that women must make no sound, must never show their weariness. The flame wavers across a face once crowned by names: princess, lady, wife of, mother of. Each title a performance, each performance a mask. But who is she truly? Perhaps even she has forgotten, buried beneath decades of decorum, duty, and rehearsed smiles. She was raised to bring peace between kingdoms, to bear heirs, to uphold her family's honour. Yet when wars ended and children grew distant, she found herself wondering if anyone had ever asked her what she wanted. The crown upon the dressing table, heavy, gleaming, no longer symbolises glory but servitude made sacred. For years it pressed into her skull, made her neck ache, thinned her hair. Now, in the dim candlelight, she no longer wears it. And for the first time in her life, she is simply human. They say princesses were protected, but the truth is they learned to protect themselves. Silently. To guard their faith, their dignity, and sometimes their very lives. They had no swords, no armies. What they possessed was intelligence and courage. Two weapons softer than steel, but far more enduring. In the letters that survive, we see them negotiating with bishops, persuading husbands, instructing sons, keeping estates alive while men were gone. No one called them heroes, yet they were the ones who kept the world from falling apart. Each act, a letter, a marriage, a quiet decision, was a kind of hidden victory. The candle burns low. Its trembling light reflects her in the mirror, not the radiant princess of portraits, but a woman worn, steady, and calm. She has loved, perhaps a forbidden love, perhaps a wrong one, yet strong enough to haunt her to the end. She has feared, she has lost, she has been betrayed. But she endured. She lived within the boundaries, yet was never wholly consumed by them. From the outside, her life appears controlled entirely by others, but within, there exists a space no one can reach, where she keeps her memories, her faith, and all that she never spoke aloud. That hidden chamber is her true domain of freedom, small but real, wide enough for a single thought, a dream, or a secret smile. History does not record this moment. No one knows what she thought as she blew out the candle, but if you listen closely, somewhere in the silence of the night you may hear it, the faint sound of a woman accepting herself, asking for no salvation. People have always loved stories where knights rescue princesses, but most medieval princesses were never rescued. They were married off, sent away, made mothers, and died in quiet rooms. And in that quiet they learned to save themselves, not with weapons, but with will. They found tiny pockets of freedom, in books, in gardens, in lullabies, in shared glances with a loyal servant. The flame dwindles, smoke curling upward, twisting once before vanishing into the dark. Their names fade the same way, dissolved into the history of men. Yet the warmth lingers, like proof of life. Perhaps that is what they wish to leave behind. Not fame, but the assurance that they once existed, once loved, once suffered, once saved themselves. Today, when we look back, we see that Princess was never a symbol of weakness, but of endurance and intellect. They needed no rescuing, for they were never victims, only women born into a world too narrow for the vastness of their inner lives, who still found a way to breathe within it. And when the final candle dies, we understand. They never truly disappeared. They are still here, in the soft footfalls of history, in the unfinished pages of chronicles, in every modern woman learning to survive silence without losing herself. A princess does not need to be saved, for she has already saved herself, with wit, with resolve, and with a smile gentle enough to survive in a world that only ever allowed her to smile. History, after all, was not written only in blood and power, but also in the silence of women who learned to endure and to persist. Beneath the crown, behind the stone doors, through endless winters, they lived, not as emblems of weakness, but as steadfast souls who kept their flame alive against the cold winds of fate. They were not allowed to choose their paths, yet they gave meaning to every step. They were married off, commanded, forced to smile, yet still they preserved a small space of their own, a space to breathe, to think, to love. In a world ruled entirely by men, they discovered power in what could not be seen. A shrewd letter, a quiet decision, a calm gesture capable of shifting the course of things. And so, centuries later, we understand. Strength does not belong only to those who wield the sword, but also to those who survive in silence without losing themselves. Their endurance, gentleness, and intellect remind us that some victories have no drums, only a faint breath in the dark and the quiet faith that morning will come. Today, we no longer live in castles, yet each of us still carries invisible walls of duty, expectation, and fear. Their lesson is not rebellion, but preservation. To hold on to oneself within stillness, to turn limits into frames within which beauty can be drawn, to light a small candle even when the night grows heavy. For in the end, what carries humanity across every age remains the same, the will to live meaningfully. The princesses of the Middle Ages never waited to be saved. They saved themselves, with intellect, with courage, and with faith that life, though fragile, was worth keeping. And that too is the lesson for us now, that amid the noise and hardness of the modern world, if we can remain gentle enough to understand and brave enough to continue, we have already won.